Hello and welcome to another episode of Secure Insights with NDK Cyber. This week I'm very excited to be joined by Constantine Antoniou. Constantine for me is a real symbol of somebody who hasn't sort of necessarily stuck with a one-track career and really highlights how you can perhaps shift around in a particular career with the basis of OT security, coming from an engineering background, working for some of the biggest names in the space, but then applying that skill set and that knowledge base and those softer skills to a more sales orientated role moving forward. So I think this is a real good insight into where a career can take you. It doesn't necessarily have to be on one path for the whole journey. So really excited to share this on with you and open to the feedback as always. Well, Constantine, thank you very much for joining me today. Welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
For those that have listened to a few episodes on the podcast now, we tend to have more technical or technically minded security folk on here who are sort of more practitioners in the space. But Constantine, you'll tell us in a moment, but you've come from a technical background, but you're now in the more customer-facing sales aspect of the role. So do
Right.
you mind give us
Yeah,
a brief overview of your journey so far?
for sure. I mean, there's some elements that there's a few folks from my generation that will identify with similar stories. You know, when I back when I did engineering school, we're talking longer than I care to admit ago. A lot of the thoughts were, you go through high school, and a lot of times in those days, what you were most primed for was to go into mechanical engineering. Not that they were trying to get you there, it's just that that's what you studied in high school. You did more physics, motion. So that part of your brain would get turned on and think, well, maybe mechanical would be the direction I go in. Nowadays, there's so much more exposure to computers and all that and technology that I'm sure the conversation is more balanced. Not far into my research, I realized probably electrical engineering was going to be the path, and then the more research I did, I was like, oh, it's got to be computers. Computers is where, I mean, this is where everything is going. So I ended up, I mean, it's kind of a funny story because my father's actually a fairly famous engineer in the field. He wrote the first book on digital signal processing in the 70s,
Okay,
and
cool.
ended up starting the engineering school that I inevitably went to. So I actually took his class, and my older brother was in the school at the same time. We were both in the same class. It was almost the makings of a sitcom.
I was going to
Um,
say the dinner
but
table must have been pretty one-sided in
uh,
terms of topics.
well, it was funny. My dad's from Cyprus, and he's got more of that hardcore sort of immigrant parent mentality, right? Like, so he was also very, very keyed into the ethics of, like, well, we're his sons, and there can be no appearance of any impropriety, as well as like no conflict of interest. Like, even when we did his class, he wouldn't mark our papers and stuff like that. He wouldn't, or our exams. He would hand them off to be marked by someone else. But so and he also helped shape my idea that he just said, computers are the future. So, like, even though he's an electrical engineer, he wasn't pushing me that direction. He never was really pushing me into engineering anyway. But so I ended up picking computer, but I ended up doing a minor in electrical because that was sort of my father's land. So I did his courses, which were like in signal processing and stuff like that. So a lot of my friends were in that world. And then I ended up working for a company called Power Measurement, which is ended up being bought by Schneider 10 years later. So to give you the bit of that journey, obviously with school, they have a lot of these good programs have co-op programs. So by the time I was done, I had 6 separate jobs, kind of had, almost like a smorgasbord of different types of roles. Everybody wanted to be a hardware design engineer. We all, like, that
Okay.
was just kind of something tangible. So a lot of computer engineers were like, we were all hoping that we would get that cool hardware, FPGA design job, or some kind of cool, electronics engineering type job. Those were really few and far between already, and a lot of FPGA work was already a software type thing. You were using design programs all day. So, a lot of people would roll their eyes and go, "Yeah, hardware design. You're still programming, man." So in the end, we realized programming was key. So I when I finished, I had done, worked for different jobs for the government agencies up in when I was in Canada at the time. So the Ministry of Transportation and Highways and stuff like that. I worked for the Hydro Company, which is basically the power company in British Columbia. And then I went out east and worked for Nortel, which was like, famously, they don't exist anymore, but at the time they were a juggernaut, right? And like it was my first exposure to an absolutely massive company that was in Ottawa. And but I decided I wanted to work at this firm I'd heard about called Power Measurement, and really switched on young, kind of almost startup, but doesn't really fit the name startup because it was extremely profitable because they had, by the time I joined, they had kind of built some of the first digital power measurement products. So they were a competitor of Schneider or Square D at the time.
Wow.
So
So startup, but still, what? How many people? What sort of turnover are we talking when it was
when
that
I
size?
started, 50 people, right? Maybe
Wow.
50 people, and fast forward 10 years later when we were bought, it was about 400 people if you include all of our reps and all that. And then we got bought by Schneider, which at the time had 85,000 employees, I think, uh, and now has 140 or 135,000. So yeah, big change. But to rewind, yeah, when I first started, and this is something I know you have some people in your on your podcast that are sort of younger engineers, sort of looking at how to think about a career in this world. And I will say you have to figure out to some extent how to advocate for yourself, because I was always a pretty talkative guy, and I didn't I when they're sifting the pan, looking at all the different people they can choose from, and they're trying to find people to go into sales and marketing or any of that stuff. Well, I kind of fit that world. My work term was in their customer service department, but I also was doing I did do some firmware design, like coding type stuff. So they were like, yeah, they kind of had earmarked me for, oh, this guy's good with clients, and which was nice to know. But I had to advocate, and I had to ask that the founder, like one of the founders, I said, look, I know you guys, we've arranged for this job, but for me, I didn't study computer engineering to become a non-technical person or this quickly. I want to become a master at this. I was pretty serious about it, right? And to his credit, he went, all right. Well, I can't tell you for sure what position we're going to put you in, but we do want to offer you, and we'll consider that deeply. And I said, okay, but just know that it's going to be better for everyone in the long run, I think, if you put me in design. Unfortunately, they put me in a really cool like firmware design job that it ended up really making a great start to my career. I got to work on some really big stuff. Ended up being one of the first, group of this 6 to 8 people that ended up designing the first ion meter, which is like was by Power Measurement, which ended up being, it's a big part of the Schneider line now. The ion architecture, and so I have a bunch of patents from that land. So I naively thought, oh, I'll do a year, maybe 2 years in this, and I'll be a master. Of
Yeah.
course, anyone who has a long career knows there's no such thing as mastery, and of course now everyone throws around the term 10,000 hours for mastery. So in 2 years you're never going to get there, right? But I ended up doing 7 years. So by the end of that, I was a lead architect. I was a lead project manager, and I was kind of handling pretty much everything we were doing. It was a pretty cool job. And dramatically, I decided to retire from coding at the age of 30. so so when that was over, I went on a
Timed.
vacation to Europe. And when I came back, I was now customer facing. So and then I did a similar thing. I thought, you know what, I'll do client projects. I'll do customer projects maybe for a couple years, and then I'll move into more executive sales or commercial aspects of what we do get. I always said I got to get on the other side of the purchase order. Like it's there. It's a different job. It's a very different job to be in the position to try to think about how we would commercially structure an engagement with a client. And it can be, if you know what's on the other side, which I do because I did both sets of jobs. I guess I didn't finish how many years it ended up being. So it ended up being 13 years that I was doing field projects. So by the time I was 20 years in, I finally went to the executive sales side. But and that started as, it just started with doing, kind of like architecture design, and like for clients, jobs that we'd already won, how to really nail and dial in the design. But very quickly, I realized I had or actually, I guess the executive realized I had a talent for projects that were in trouble, that had serious technical issues, not necessarily because the technology wasn't ready for it, but sometimes, as a lot of us know, a job gets sold a certain way, and what the client wants is sometimes maybe not even something that will be that useful for them, but it was the conversation that happened in the room at the time. They thought they needed it. And when you get there on the ground and you're actually executing the project, you find out there can be a lot of different nuances to what they're actually trying to do on the ground level when you're dealing with it. Sometimes the job was even sold above their heads, right? So you're dealing with the rank and file, the people who actually have to execute the project. And they're like, no, 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 I don't want this. I want this. I want that. I want that. And that's where scope creep comes from, right? So the personality of the project manager in those types of jobs has to be, if it's not turnkey stuff that's been done 100 different times with other clients, it requires a lot of creativity, right? So you need to be in a position where you can arrive and talk out a set of problems, get your whiteboard, get the marker going, and really. And sometimes you're dealing with a confluence or an intersection of many different, not just personalities, but corporate departments in that company and agendas. So there's a whole bunch of real soft skill stuff that you have to learn about. Oh, right. This person is in alliance with that person. This politically, so it's all stuff that as engineers, there's no course. I mean, I think smarter engineering programs try to integrate this. I think the problem, I know this because my father started the engineering school I went to it. So I've asked him and seen some of the challenges of building the curricula, right? There's to get accreditation as a university, there's certain core topics you really have to cover or you'll never get accreditation. But so humanities get the short end of the stick far too often. The program I went to, thankfully, I thank my dad for it, I guess, but there were some very good humanities courses that really stuck with me. There was a course on ethics that the guy who taught it was really we made fun of him a bit because he was sort of he was I say this with love, but because he was enthusiastic. And the reality is actually that enthusiasm was really useful. He got us talking, he got us thinking. And we were all engineers, so we're all sitting there with our arms folded, being like, well, humanities, personally, I've spent a lot of time studying the humanities and studying a lot of things outside of my time, but that had to happen after I finished engineering school. This is, I guess, another thing I say often to young engineers. I go, well, you gotta understand that when you're doing an engineering program, it's trying to configure you to be good at a certain set of problems, right? And when I got out of engineering school, I said I felt like I'd just gone to the gym and trained half my body, like this hulking, left arm, right? And then someone goes, let's see your right arm. It's not important. It's not important. Look over here, right? Because the humanities side, the soft touch stuff, the understanding how people operate is, and a lot of us that go into engineering are a little more, I joke about it, and I think it's more publicly acceptable to say this, but we're all a bit on the spectrum, right? Not everybody in engineering is, and not everybody shows it the same way, but our brains work pretty kind of differently than the mainstream. So, and that's nowadays, the good thing is that's celebrated in a way that it wasn't before. Geek culture sort of won the day, right? In a lot of ways, but. So I often say, well, when you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with your career, you really do got to think about, sometimes it's tempting when you built that one left arm is really strong. It's tempting to only want to use your left arm and only talk about things that involve that, and your left brain and all that kind of thinking, structure, this, that, and that, and none of that other stuff matters. And I think a really full life actually involves understanding both those parts of yourself. So. Career wise, getting to the point. Some people know they want to go into sales right away. Some people are about the money. Some people say, I want to make as much money as possible. So they want to get to sales as soon as possible. That's acceptable too, right? Personally, I said no to a lot of extra money for a lot of years just because I was interested in building a career or a fulfilling life, not just life, career, but when you get to the point where you are actually on the sales side, you actually understand what everybody does. So, look, years ago, a young guy asked me for some advice when I was about, I don't know, 5-6 years into my career. And I finished giving him some very good advice. And then I paused and I said, wait a minute, I just told you exactly what I've done with my career. you have to figure this out for yourself. So take what I just told you with a grain of salt. We're all going to speak to an agenda from where we came from, and sometimes what's that one? It's from one of those that commencement speech that says, like advice is a form of nostalgia. Some people give
Yes.
advice. It is. Oh yeah, what you should do is exactly everything I did, because that would mean that the choices I made were valid. So, and that's cold comfort when somebody just wants you to tell you, they want you to tell them, this is what you should do, and A, B, C, D, especially engineers, right? They want to, I've
Quite
had it
linear, I
with,
suppose. Yeah.
yeah, I've had it with a friend of mine. We were joking about it. I've had it with, I take my health and fitness very seriously. There's a lot of things I do that are now pretty much in the mainstream, but I've been at it for, 25, 30 years. But where you kind of go, okay, trying to get your sleep schedule right. Like, what are the things you need to do? Now it's in the mainstream thanks to, Huberman Lab and all these different podcasts, but it wasn't 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? So those of us who were doing it often got made fun of, right? Like, oh, what are you worried about, man? I'll sleep when I'm dead. And you're like, I don't know. I think sleep's pretty fundamental, like, um, yeah. And so this one friend had said, so what's your secret? He wanted me to tell him one secret, right? And I said, oh, well, I hate to break it to you, but it's actually seven. It's seven things, and none of them are secrets. They're all pretty obvious. Everybody is just, are you willing to do the work to make sure you got a good sleep schedule? Make sure that your life is balanced socially. Make sure that you are building your career. It's hard. It's hard work to build uh, a life that has all the elements I'm talking about, and it gets especially hard when you get to that age where you decide to have kids. And I don't know, maybe personal question, maybe you don't answer that on the podcast, but if
No,
you
not
have
at all.
kids, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
7 weeks in, so to our
Oh,
first. So
right, right.
I'm
So,
going through what you're talking
so
about right now. Yeah.
yeah, the fundamental change, right? So, and that's, I don't have kids myself, and part of it is that I did build this life that had so many different components to it, that it would be challenging to have. I mean, I have lots of nieces and nephews, and I have a lot of kids in my life because all my friends had kids, and I like kids. I like spending time with kids, but the sheer what you're going through right now, it's the beginning, the indoctrination period, right? And
Yeah.
you sort of go, how did you get anything? How will you get anything done? Like, I know eventually you do, but
It's a case of figuring it out, I think, and then like you pointed out there, finding balance in a lot of things you do. And I really like the point you make around, it's not just about finding that in the career, but that will transfer into social life or life outside of the career, and then vice versa. If you get one of those sorted, the higher chance of the next one sorting itself out naturally is much higher. So no, I completely get where you're going with that. And I think as well, it's outside in, having that credibility, talking to the people that you're ultimately selling to is likely a huge thing, but also the ability to actually solve their problems, genuinely help and solve the problems, like you say, getting the whiteboard out, that must uh, be worth its weight in gold, surely.
it can be. I mean, look, some clients, the good news is that you'll also have solution architects and other people to work with you. I think a big part of understanding where you fit in the sales land, we talk a little bit about the concept of a player coach. Sometimes you get a coach who wants to be a player still. If you get a sales manager who wants to be a player still, and they keep going, I'm going to join you for that sales call, or I'm going to step in there, right? And similarly, if you came from that world, you're not a player now. So you can get the whiteboard out, but you've got to corral the voices in the room so that the right voices get to speak, right? And what's really cool, I think, about a lot of changes in corporate culture is that, you know, sure, it started with movements, or it had been going for a long time, but it started with certain movements that were focused on, say Me Too, or these kind of movements that focused on, okay, we're going to focus on a specific group of people. But the more justice that is created for, say, a specific group, and then this group, and then eventually, if enough of that happens, you go, actually, everybody should have an ability to speak, right? Including the quiet white guy in the corner who never speaks up, right? And so good leadership is looking at the entire group and going, okay, I've got a ton of resources in this room, a ton of brains. Unfortunately, the forum we've chosen requires extroversion to some extent. So how do I make it so that the introverted people who happen to be just as smart as anybody else feel comfortable in this environment? So, the psychological safety aspect that people talk about. But how do you also go, this person's not going to give me their best information in this meeting. So I'm probably going to have to go up after this meeting and carve out 15 minutes to pop in their office and go, hey, I was just wondering about, I noticed someone's reading body language too, especially with, like I say, the spectrum-y stuff. The way that somebody more on the spectrum will communicate that they find something fascinating or interesting or they have input is very subtle, So you kind of have to read body language and go, okay, because in the meeting you'll often go to that person. Did you have anything to add? And they'll go, no, we're good, right? And then if it's just a closed door and you and them, they'll go, she might go, actually, I really wasn't on board with this or that or whatever because they feel safe with you. You're not going to run off and tell that other person that they didn't agree. So, yeah, and to go back to what you were saying, having a technical background really helps primarily because you have to have self-esteem in your intelligence if you're going to go up in front of a whole room of people and go, I don't know what I'm talking about. Will you guys help me know what I'm talking about? And if you have a voice in your head going, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. These people are way smarter than you. Like the whole classic imposter syndrome. You're never going to be able to hold that marker and actually write things out. Right. And what goes with that is also letting a room breathe. Uncomfortable silences are okay. Right. Like getting good at that kind of stuff, especially with engineers. Sometimes they're just thinking, our, one of the original founders of power measurement, a lot of people were really terrified of him because he was so smart and he was kind of like our Bill Gates, and people will get really intimidated if you leant back in his chair and started thinking, right? And personally, I didn't have that kind of relationship with him. When we met, it was kind of a confluence of circumstances. I had met him through a friend who did a co-op just briefly. I knew I wanted to work there, and when we had the job interview, the guy who was co-interviewing with him, who was going to hire me, who ended up hiring me, his brother had just done a work term with me at Nortel, and we shared a cubicle. So I started with some funny stories, and he laughed, and so our relationship was started with the comedy to some extent, and that just lasted throughout there's always a sense of humor in our relationship, right? So when Ron went back and thought, I didn't presume he was thinking about how to eviscerate it or take me down. He would think, and there were times where he would think and he would say something that was hard to hear, but I was always like writing it down because this guy knows what he's talking about, right? He's the founder, right? And he was also really good. He was a good man on top of it. So I feel very, a dear friend who we worked with for years passed away recently, and we had a big celebration of life. And I just thought, well, when you think about just the great privilege of having been able to work for a company where we were allowed to kind of be ourselves and grow, and we were all also great friends. Like it was kind of weird. Nobody had kids yet. It was a young company, and it was just like, hey, what's going on this weekend? We all hung out together. We liked each other that much that we would work together and then hang out on weekends together. So that's kind of, I think if you, and also, I guess this leads to anyone asking about the career, like that's hard to find. Obviously, startups can be a toxic version of that, where the whole thing is it's a work culture and all we do is work, and we're best buds and we work. We had work play for sure. That weekends, it wasn't that kind. This was before everyone had internet at home. I'm talking about 1995, right? So it was the beginnings of dial up, and we built a gaming server at the company that we would play, and it took forever to set up, and it was not easy. Right now, that stuff's just a couple of clicks and you're up and running, right? So not to sound like the old guy. Oh, you kids, it's so easy.
No, I get it. But no, I think solid culture is important there. But with just my last sort of question on your sort of career to date, so to speak. If I'm in that more engineering space now, maybe looking to transition into sales or even a more customer-facing role, is there any sort of, I guess, tips you'd give to get into that sort of space?
You always want to let people know that you're thinking about it, because that's how mentorship. I've got a call tomorrow with somebody that is thinking about making some moves, and I'm not that I have 100 hours a week to help, but anybody, I always maybe this would change if I was famous, but like I always have time for anyone who makes an effort, right? That's just generally my philosophy. And if somebody, if I get nothing out of it, somebody asks me for help in an earnest way and in a way that makes me feel like this person could use my help, I'll carve out, even if it's half an hour or an hour, to chat with them about it, right? I've done that throughout my career, and I think so. Having an eye on the direction you might want to move in, and asking the right questions along the way. People are hungry. People like telling their stories, right? I mean, why am I doing this podcast? I don't mind telling a story. I don't like talking about myself, right? Um, and I guess I didn't finish. Like, so once I actually, about a decade ago, I shifted over to what's an area called process automation. So I was in New York City, and during that time, I was working primarily with like New York City Transit, New York City DEP, Metro North Railroad, all these agencies and stuff like that, as well as water districts and all that stuff. So it was infrastructure heavy. From a sales role, it was kind of perfect because all your travel was local. You always slept in your own bed, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, some roles in sales involve an incredible amount of travel, and I mean, I often joke that I should start a YouTube channel just on business travel, and like, hey, listen, there's certain things you got to get good at if you're going to do this, right?
Yeah.
And how do you not burn yourself out? Because you really a week on the road beating yourself up and eating out, you got to have a week back where you're eating healthy and you're exercising, and that's not what we often do. We get back and we're so worn out that we just keep making bad decisions. And I mean, I know it, not in the land of fat shaming, but I used to say, there's a thing I called management chubby, and it was like, male men who do a lot of road jobs. You just, you should skip the fries, bro. But you're eating out 8 times a week, let's
Yeah.
say, or maybe more. You gotta skip the fries. I'm sorry, man. So
Must be
that's
easy to
that's
fall into that. Like you say, if it's
oh.
if you're shattered from a week of travel and everything else, and your brain, your
And
body
then a
is
voice
tired.
in yeah, your voice in your head goes, "I worked hard all week. I deserve this," right? But
I,
it's not.
I would.
It's unfortunately, yeah, it's not going to help you, right? And I love fries. Don't get me wrong, I do. I love. There's a lot of foods I love, but so I ended up, yeah, that job was good for that. But then I actually went and did a startup. So over the years, I guess I didn't, I papered over a bit of the middle part. Those 13 years in doing field work,
Sorry. Yeah.
for 6 or 7 of them. Well, it's me. I just been going all over the place, but 6 or 7 of those was I had my own company that I originally, called Antonio Technologies, and it was basically it became a fixer type firm. Like I would go in. I was hired specifically to take over projects that were on, like project manager number 4 or project manager number 5. And it was actually a lot of fun, but that was really hard because there were times where I was just flying. I'd fly to Okinawa, Japan, and I'd spend 2 weeks
Wow.
there, and then I'd fly back to. So it was exciting. I'm glad it's on my resume. I'm glad I did it. But I often joke. In those years, I was older. It was like I was like 12, 13 years ago. I was probably older then biologically than I am now because I just was like beating my. It was just so hard on your body, right?
Exhausting. Yeah. Yeah.
And then that job and sorry, then when I went to executive sales, like I said, so timeline wise, that's now 20 years into my career. I went to executive sales, did that for almost 3 years, and an opportunity to do a startup in Las Vegas in private aviation came up. And because of the background I had, I mean, to some extent, the point of my resume is I can figure out your technology and master it in a period of time, probably faster than most, and then I can add the things I know to that space. So I that was cool because I got to get back into app development and design and investor documents and stuff like that. So I built with a team in India. So we were building what they call the MVP, the minimum viable product, which was 2 apps and a booking app, like an employees staff or like management app,
Okay. Cool.
basically scheduling app, and then a console for booking flight transactions. And we got to the point where I think we really had a cool idea and it could have gone, but we needed 10-20 million dollars yesterday kind of thing. And it was one of those like, we can keep burning this cash. And me and my co-founder, we went to engineering school together, and he owns a private airline. And was like, honestly, I think your airline is such a good business. I think you're wasting, to some extent, if I was your executive coach, I would tell you to wrap up this startup because it's a cool idea. But if we don't get the money soon, we're both burning holes in our pockets, right? Fortunately, I also said, and this goes in the line of advice. If you're ever going to partner with somebody, trying to, like it's the joke that people make, right? It's probably more serious than getting married, to start a business with somebody,
Yeah.
right?
Spend
You
more
know,
time with
you,
them
you
probably. It's
a lot
have
of
more
time with
difficult
them.
conversations.
Yeah, and you have to be ready to. So, and I just said to him, my worst outcome here would be a year from now. We're both so pissed off that we lose our friendship, and like I'm willing to write off the extra income I didn't make for these 3 years doing the startup or 2.5 years. That's fine. That was part of the risk, right? I knew that there was a risk in it. I made a lot less than I would have normally made in the field, and that was fun to do. I'm glad I did it. I learned a ton. And then the other plus I always say is that when you go back to a job that pays you every 2 weeks, you go, wow, this feels nice. you know,
What
you
is
know,
this?
what
Every
is
two
this?
weeks? Yeah.
This company respects me. They pay me every 2 weeks. I have vacation time. Like so. And I think there's a lot of fetishizing of the startup culture that has gone on, and I think there's enough talk right now of people being like, yeah, startups aren't all that. In fact, there's a lot of comedy around lampooning it, right? Like,
There's
um,
it's
so
horses for courses, isn't it? I think if that's your situation at the time and you're fully aware of, like you say, the risks and the what this could be, worst case maybe. But I think people get maybe caught up in what this could be. But then,
I'm gonna make 10 million, 20 million, 40 million. I'm gonna become a
yeah,
billionaire. Like, it's a bit crazy, right? It's the math of starting a unicorn is kind of similar to the math of becoming the next Brad Pitt or George Clooney. You know what I mean? Like, it's astronomically against you, and the more you study this stuff, and not to discourage people from trying it, but if you talk to any entrepreneur, even the people who built unicorns, and say to them, and I used to say this to any of my friends who were really successful. I said, if you could go back, if you had to relive it, still knowing that you would be successful, would you do it? And they all go, their heads go in their hands, and they go, no, no, man, it was way harder than I thought.
yeah,
There's a couple lucky cases. There's a couple lucky. Same with actors. There's a couple lucky actors that become the story of, well, it happened for so and so. He walked off the bus to Hollywood and he booked that. His first audition was that series, and yeah. And he got to Silicon Valley and they just loved him, and he got series. His first round of funding in the first 3 weeks. Well, those are complete massive outlier stories, right? So the happy end of that story is we did wrap it up just before COVID started, and it was good timing, and we're still good friends. And my thing was, look, I want to be in a position where 10 years from now, if I were to come to you and say, hey, I've got this great idea, you wouldn't be shaking your head going, yeah, right.
yeah,
We're not doing this again, right? And I wouldn't be, if I had a great idea, I wouldn't be skipping you. I'd go to you first, right? So let's especially when down the road his airline will it continues to grow and probably will end up, who knows, someone's going to try to buy it, I'm sure. So anyway, yeah, and that's another lesson in the land of don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, kind of thing, right? If you're going to take a loss on a startup, and like you said, the expectations of, oh, we were going to be millionaires, and you're kind of letting the dream die when you close it down, and then what's left is bitterness and acrimonious kind of stories about how it would have been better if she didn't do that or he didn't do this, and you kind of go, oh, well, yeah, it's a day in the life of a startup person, right? Maybe a year or
yeah.
2 years in the life, right? So
Been there and done it though. So that all wrapped up, and then that leads us to where you're at now, right? That's in the more sales front end role.
yeah, so I kind of had, yeah, and you learn a lot over I guess what it was the big plus for, say, I worked on and off for Schneider for so many years, because like I said, they did acquire Power Measurement back in 2005, so we're talking quite some time ago. And that opened the door for me to work in a bunch of different roles within Schneider, including a few I haven't mentioned. I worked for their energy as a service company. It was a startup they had done called Green Structure that is still going, and really a kind of a cool idea, right? Energy as a service as opposed to building a microgrid on your building at no cost to you, kind of stuff. Um, the technology is developing and will probably be far more common 5 years from now, and people will know the term. But as it is now, you say energy as a service, and people go, "Oh, what's that? What's that? What's that about?" Like not as clear. But it was that I learned a lot there too. I learned a ton about how battery, what they call BESS, battery energy storage systems work, um, and for me, look, I always say the first year you do any job, you're not going to sleep as well because your brain, your nervous system's trying to rewire around uh, a set of responsibilities that you don't really have a handle on yet. Uh, by some point, if you know any organization has its own overhead. So if I had, let's say I'm doing the exact same job, but I had left Schneider and I'd gone to one of the competitors or something like that, my brain would be wired around the Schneider mentality. And I would be like, oh, well, here's how that's going to work. And someone would have to take me aside and go, it doesn't work that way here. I've seen it in, we had some people come over from more of the big four come to Schneider, and I have to be like, hey, Schneider, it's not Schneider's not some people might disagree, but I think Schneider has a really collaborative and friendly, I like everyone I work with a lot. And so you can't really go to someone's boss's boss and try to get them in like a lot of trouble because they're not doing something for you. And I think ultimately you can do that. Of course, you can do that in any organization, but ultimately the first move is always to try to build a consensus with that person if you can. It's still tough. I'm sure we're a huge company. There's going to be departments where that's more challenging, right? But I have found that people get on the same page pretty fast as far as like, okay, well, we're all in this together. So how are we going to make how do we make all the horses pull the cart in the same direction, right? And with that kind of language, maybe that's just my background for years as a fixer. I just naturally go that direction. But I hear stories of a lot of other companies that are much more toxic about how they, it's just in silos, infighting all the time, right? And anybody who studies organizational management knows that once you scale beyond like 100 employees, your first troubles begin. And when you scale beyond 1,000, there's a whole another set, like it's exponential. Yeah. And that's why a whole bunch of corporate functions exist that we kind of go, why would you need a department for that? It's like, well, I'll tell you why.
because we're people, and that's how people operate, how they
Yeah,
work, and it's very different. And there's, like you say, there's layers of intricacies between that. So, but no, it's good to hear that the Schneider's functioning, at least from your point of view, very, very well, and it's very collaborative. So,
yeah. So I think where you were maybe going to go was, how did I get in all that? I guess the important part that I haven't really brought up is all these projects were OT focused, right? So operational technology focused, right? And when it comes to cybersecurity, back in the day, a lot of years ago, plus years ago, I had for a year, I was the cybersecurity expert for the company, Power Measurement. I went to a conference or two. I learned a lot about how encryption worked, public key, private key, all that kind of stuff. And the big takeaway for me was that, oh man, this is a moving target. Like, it doesn't matter how skilled you get at fighting it. The people who are trying to get to your assets are getting more skilled all the time. And the last bunch of years, unfortunately, ransomware has led to an incredible amount of funding for not just criminal organizations, but I guess they would all be considered criminal, but basically any organizations that are building the ransomware as a service and these types of things, where non-technical people can now get into the business of trying to ransomware companies by licensing, by hiring the service, right? So personally, I learned a lot over the years because that got implanted in my head 20 plus years ago. I was always sort of thinking about these aspects when I was executing projects. And a lot of times the answer in 20 years ago was, well, we'll just air gap it. It's on an RS-485 network. It's two wires, a 2-wire RS-485 network. It's not on an Ethernet. means it's, by necessity it's slower. It's accessed by a modem that does 19.2 or something, or 9600 baud. You need to know the phone number, and you need to know, and sometimes you'd be like, that's all you need to know, the phone number? Yeah, but you'd have to speak in the protocol of the devices, and nobody knows our protocol.
Right.
Nowadays, you can reverse engineer a protocol with AI. And you can ask ChatGPT to read a PCAP and say, hey, tell me, can you put together a document on how this protocol probably works, right? I'm not saying ChatGPT is that advanced yet, but I know I know this kind of stuff's being worked on. It's actually the stuff that gives me the most anxiety, is if the right people figure out how to plug in some of these tools into automation, right? Like automated attack vector type stuff, right?
That's the
But
thing,
anyway,
right?
I cut you off. Maybe that wasn't what you were, the direction you were heading
No, that
in.
was, and it was a case of, I think linking in your background, the credibility you bring to the table, and ultimately, for the listeners, what sort of things is it? Services? Is it product? Is it a bit of both you're selling at the moment? How does that work? And I guess working towards, what are the challenges you're seeing in the space at the moment, and what are you undertaking to get by, to get around that? There's about
Yeah,
four
well,
questions in there.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. I think I answer questions without them even being answered. So let me see. Well, one thing about the team I'm on is that uh, we are not a product security organization. That is something that is within Schneider. We got serious quite a long time ago. When I worked on process automation, we launched the M580, which was from the ground up meant to be Achilles 2 certified, which means a third party, tries to basically pen test, break into see if they can compromise your device. So, ground up cybersecurity design is sort of a new thing in the industrial space. Shouldn't have been, of course, but clients weren't asking for encrypted communications, 20 years ago. Even if, as I often say, even if they did, there was you weren't going to implement an encryption stack from scratch yourself. You probably didn't have the resources or the processing power to do it. So those parts of our organization are separate. We do work with them. We are aware of their efforts, and we will bring them in where necessary. But we are actually more like a consulting arm. So we're meant to be brought in on engagements where someone has OT/IT cybersecurity issues, period. Right. Of course, one of our ways in is that we work with a lot of clients on the power side, secure power. We work with them in the buildings. We work with any kind of digital power energy management type stuff. So we have deep client relationships there. And when a client gets to a point where they realize, and this is to I think your point, over the last, especially 5 years, a lot of companies are waking up to this sheer amount of tech debt they have from not investing in cybersecurity below their DMZ, right? And for those who don't really know, right, a lot of times in the way things are cybersecurity works, for everything below your enterprise layer, all your banking, your laptops, all your spreadsheets and all that stuff, that the internet connection comes into the building, you have an enterprise layer there. Below that, there's often what they call a demilitarized zone, DMZ, that is designed to protect between all your much more proprietary assets below that and your operational equipment. And a lot of very careful configuration has to go into that to make sure that DMZ is set up right. But then as you go down what they call the Purdue layers, you're talking about moving closer and closer to the hardware and to even down to the wire, right? There's sensors and stuff like that. And each layer is an opportunity for some kind of attack vector, right? And so as a team, we often get hired. One of my top clients is a life sciences company, which I can't name, but they have one of the key parts they have is they have somebody who came in at a high enough level in the company who is a change maker, and somebody who knows a lot about OT and about what needs to be done, and it was willing to fight at the executive level for funding for a program to not just do a ton of assessments on each of the sites, but then also have a downstream, okay, what are we going to do about it?
Oh, cool. Yeah.
How do we have security specialists? How do we build a team that is very teamwork oriented, working with each of the sites? And so a lot of these companies have like a distributed footprint that is so vast that throughout the world, name a country, they have a plant there, right? And that, as you can imagine, that's not easy, right? And then at the executive level, they've been talking about risk from an IT perspective for years, but they're hearing about this OT tech debt to some extent, and a lot of them, their first reaction is, "How can this happen? How can I only be hearing about this now?" And part of the problem has to do with the way tech corporations are organized, right? CTOs and CIOs and sometimes CISOs now are fairly, I don't want to say fairly new role, but newer role. And so that's this, information security officer, right? Chief information security officer. And those people are responsible for the IT cybersecurity and the OT cybersecurity, right? And they're much more I think the good ones are. Some companies don't have a huge OT footprint as much, and everyone has power and everyone has all that. If you don't have a giant manufacturing plant, you may not be as focused on these issues. But when it comes down to the plant level, everyone's worried about downtime, right? Everyone understands that if this plant went down for, almost always they know the number. Hey, what would it cost you if this plant went down per hour? Oh man, people get nervous when you talk about it, right? You go, well, all right, so what are we talking about per week? Per week can't go down for a week. All right, but let's talk per day then, right? And the numbers can be really staggering depending on the industry, right? So if you're talking about something like semiconductors, anyone who's listening from the semiconductor land, they're probably shaking their heads right now, going, "I don't want to think about it."
Yeah.
Right? Because when you're talking about a fab, a plant where just there's so much complexity, power sensitivity that goes into some production lines, that even if a hacker was able to, change the voltage on some pump by, a few volts, or make sure that more current flows or something like that, and that kind of hack, it's too sensitive, right? So it would destroy the fab of the plant. They'd have to throw it all out, stop talking millions of dollars sometimes, right? And I'm not a super expert on that, but I've just heard enough stories over the years. So, the challenge that a lot of corporations, I think, are having is that they just don't understand the depth of the problem they're up against when it comes to what's in their OT space and the tech debt that they have accumulated. And when they're told, "Hey, you need to spend not a couple $100,000, but you need to spend millions of dollars," their first reaction is like, why have I not been told? How did this happen? We found sometimes we got to be very careful when we do the assessment, because we don't want to get a bunch of people in trouble, because almost always there were people in the OT space who were like, "We were trying to tell you this. We were trying to tell you this, but we never got a seat at the table,"
Yeah.
And then in that meeting, when I brought it up, someone said, "We don't have time for that today. Listen, let's focus on X, Y, and Z, and this other issue you're talking about, we'll table that for another time." Okay. The people who are in charge of usually the head of the OT space isn't somebody that necessarily has a seat into the executive committee, right? Or any of that. So that person ends up being told, "Oh, by the way, keep it cybersecure." And I would say it's like the seventh hat that gets thrown at them. And look, we all have complicated jobs, but if someone said to you today, "Hey, on top of everything you're doing, can you be responsible for this initiative that nobody really understands, and that everybody talks about, and so many people have cybersecurity in their business card title, but they're not really in that world. They don't know anything about operational cyber." So it's tricky, and I mean it is. It's good because we know how to help, but even then, we're still going to be. There's a lot of questions we have to ask, because it's like, well, what kind of organization do you have? What kind of ability will we have, even if we did these assessments, to do the mitigation work? Are you allowed to? This particular person I mentioned from the life sciences company, he's doing that hard work within his organization. We can't do that for them. And he's sticking his neck out and taking a risk. And that's why a lot of this stuff doesn't get dealt with, because people don't take risks like that, right? But in the end, as we get rolling, I think they're going to see ultimately, like, what has been great is, and actually even better than I thought it was going to work. to a site. Every site we've gone and done an assessment at, they have been, we're really glad you guys are here. We
Well,
were,
I was going to ask you this. There must be those situations clearly that you maybe face that. Even the internal staff as well, they face that pushback of, oh, it's not 10,000 or it's even 100,000. It's million plus I've got to spend to do this. But coming out the other side of that, there surely must be those success stories of, you know what, we're really glad we did that initial risk assessment because that highlighted this, which then led to this. Thank you. So uh, I was first of all going to sort of tee up a question along the lines of how do you get around those challenges, and I think you've touched on a few points there. But have you got maybe an example or two where they've gone through that whole process, they've come out the other side, and then gone, you know what, really glad we're now set up for this because we've got a proper system, people, process, technology in place that in theory works towards better cybersecurity for our OT.
yeah, I mean, this ends up being a bit, philosophical, and I bring this up a lot because the core part of prevention is the core thing that makes a time travel movie exciting. Someone goes back in time and fixes something, and those in the future of that timeline never know they were saved. So the
Right,
person
got you.
is a hero, but they're never recognized for being a hero. In fact, they might even be treated like they're crazy. In the case of Sarah Connor in the Terminator 2 or whatever, right? Right, like obviously I'm a sci-fi fan, but and that's the problem with prevention in general or infrastructure in general. I mean, every politician struggles with this. Spending money on infrastructure is just not sexy. It's absolutely required, but it's not sexy. And I worked in infrastructure most of my career. So you start to go uh, internally, we have had a lot of feedback. Wow, I'm really glad we did this, or wow, this is really, sometimes someone will say, this is what I was talking about. I was hoping we would do a long time ago, right? Um, but there is the risk of, Y2K is a good example, right? How many people, when Y2K happened, when it was over and nothing happened, said, what a bust. Oh, what a scam. They all got us all revved up for nothing. And I'm like, no, we spent billions of dollars fixing it. And
Yes.
then we didn't have any problems. And then acting like, so it's the same problem, right? And don't get me wrong, there were tons of contractors who just made money off of Y2K and were scamming people there. That happened. But I would bet it's in the realm of 5% of the projects that were done were frivolous money, guys just grabbing money. But for the most part, people who quote things want to fix things. And yes, you know, as a company, we pride ourselves on that, as trying to build an engagement especially as a contractor. If you're getting a contract with a client where every year they feel like, all right, that engagement was worth it. Not like, oh, now that you guys got used, this is a classic consulting problem, right? At some point, your problem becomes the consultants, right? There's too many consultants who are trying to advise. So
Indeed.
yeah, so trying to keep your tools sharp and your team sharp, and occasionally there will be times where you kind of go, look, no team can execute 100% of the time, but the ideal is to constantly get your team back on track when maybe they missed the plot for a minute, right? Or the client's needs have shifted or changed, and how do we make sure that we can keep them happy, right? So.
Yeah, understood. Well, Constantine, we bounced around a little bit there, and there's a ton of nuggets of value throughout that whole conversation. And thank you so much for sharing your journey so far. But I guess looking forward over the next 6 to 12 months, what are you looking forward to? What are you excited about?
Well, I really, this role for me, I've been back at this particular role with Schneider for about a year. So I see a long window ahead of just continuing to grow and build with different clients. Uh, ideally, this program level engagement is the most fulfilling because you get your team going on something that really makes an impact. And I think then your ability to go to another company of a similar type and say, hey, listen, so here's what we did, usually anonymized and without any kind of information, or almost always, unless the client says you're allowed to talk about it. But you can say, hey, a life sciences type company or whatever, and say, hey, here's the type of program we are interested in and we have built previously. And where are you guys at? What do you need? Do you need to sing for yourself, or do you need me to talk to your executive? Any of that. Um, that's how we build engagement. So for me, I'm excited about just trying to help as many companies get their hands around this, because it is maturity. One of the things we talk about a lot is the cybersecurity maturity level. It's a pretty classic diagram that a lot of people use in the industry, and it's a surprising number of people are still at the beginning. When you find out, and then occasionally you engage with a team, and they're like, "Wow, these." There's one water district we dealt with recently, and man, they are following it. Their best practices are quite good.
Mm.
So our assessment didn't have a lot of red flags. It was mainly like, wow, all right, you guys really know this, and this. Here's some tuning ideas. Here's we probably want to do another assessment on this piece,
Mm.
but as far as like your general practices, I got to give you 4 thumbs up. Like this is
Nice.
impressive. Yeah, yeah. Whereas a lot of water districts we go to, and it's just they just don't have the funding, so they're filled with all sorts of issues that are kind of like, okay, some of it's saved by hard security, right? Like, I mean, this is the old school method, right? If you physically secure something well enough, and there isn't a network connection point where someone can get in, then it's better. But yeah, helping. It's the same thing when I was doing the fixer work, right? It was really painful stuff. I used to joke, "Well, is there something wrong with me that I enjoy that?"
Yeah.
Because it was very stressful. I did not, I did not sleep super well, and it was really problematic work, and often a lot of kind of what you said before, like the organizations fighting each other, the silos, and you're caught in the middle of it, and there's a bunch of agendas, and you're like, well, we're just trying to help, guys, right? But when you pull something like that together and fix something, and then everybody at the end, the client's like, that was cool, like, we really appreciate that, and hey, by the way, let's talk about what's next.
Yeah, it's
that's
class.
that feels really good. So, and I think that's at the end of the day, there's one thing this one electrician said on that one of these jobs. It was with the Navy. He was just like, "Hey, Constantine, I'm an electrician. We're electricians. You know what we like more than anything?" I said, "What?" He goes, "Turning the thing on, turning the thing on." Like, like he was like, getting the thing work. Like, that's why we're here, right? Like, so as an electrician, to work on a job and never get to turn it on, never get to get the thing turned on and signed off and leave. It was really problematic, because there have been a lot of installation errors that happened, not through the fault necessarily of it was so many different things in that particular job that it would be a whole nother podcast to talk about. So,
Well,
but
maybe
but
we'll put
but
that in.
yeah, yeah. But I did think that's true of all of us. If you're an engineer, there is part of you that has this desire to not just help, but to some extent, it fits in with the spectrumy thing. When we have a whole bunch of chaos and we can get it into order, it's very satisfying for those of us who have that kind of brain. And there's a lot more talk about this stuff now. They show videos of this is so satisfying, and it's somebody just cleaning something perfectly or whatever. And if you have that kind of brain, there's part of you that's like, that is satisfying. Why is that so satisfying, right? And I think as a in engineering, if you're going to be in the field, there has to be part of you that is comfortable with the flowing into chaos, right? And finding a way to at least decrease the entropy of
Indeed.
of the situation, right?
Indeed,
So
indeed. Well, Constantine, thank you again for sharing your journey, your insights, your background. It's colourful. It's in many ways a little bit different to maybe what you typically expect in this world, and it's clearly benefiting the role that you do at the moment. So, hopefully they gave a lot of value to the people listening. We'll wrap up there. We'll chuck a link to
perfect.
your LinkedIn below, just in case anyone wants to reach out, if that's okay. And
Sure.
we'll be in touch soon.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. And that was
Awesome.
fun.